Hi everyone, this is Gene Geog History, and today I'm going to be talking about another group. So the last three videos I did covered mixed groups within the three main clusters of East Eurasians, West Eurasians, and Sub-Saharan Africans. And today I'm going to solely focus on the three main groups, but talking about one of them. And today I'm going to talk about East Eurasians. So in order to do this, I first need to discuss what East Eurasians are. So East Eurasians are a broad anthropological slash population genetics umbrella, not a single people. It groups populations whose deep ancestry is centered in East Asia and adjacent regions, contrasting historically with West Eurasians. And I'm going to eventually talk about what West Eurasians are. So the fact that it's an umbrella, it means that they aren't the same group of people, but they have a lot of similarities, and they did come from one cluster or source. And we're going to go into the main core groups of what is now known as East Eurasians. When it comes to East Eurasia, there are two core East Asian populations, and they form the genetic and the historical core slash cluster of East Eurasia. So the first group are Northeast Asians, otherwise known with the acronym NEA. So these regions include China, those some might say specifically Northern China, but China just in general, Korea, Japan, Mongolia, and Siberia. The people that are in this area are the Han Chinese, especially the northern Han, Koreans, Japanese people, Mongols, and Tungusic people, so like the Manchu and the Evenks. So the generalized traits of the Northeast Asians are they have cold adapted ancestry, which played into their phenotype being what it is. Their strong continuity from ancient Yellow River and Amur Basin populations, which is actually from what is now known as modern China. And in addition to that, this area has a higher frequency of EDAR variants, which plays into the hair thickness and the teeth traits, as well as gland development. So the second main core group when it comes to the core East Asian populations are the Southeast Asians, and the acronym is the SEAs. This is pretty self-explanatory, really, and this covers mainland Asia and island Southeast Asia. So pretty much it involves Thai people from Thailand, Lao people from Laos, Khmer people, Vietnamese people from Vietnam, Malayan people from Malaysia, Javanese people, Filipino people from the Philippines, and indigenous groups like Orang Asli, Dayak, etc. It's very self-explanatory where these people come from. So when it comes to the traits, they are a mix of East Asian farmer ancestry plus ancient Southeast Asian hunter-gatherers. So pretty much a mix of East Asian and the indigenous South Asians, pretty much. They often have more genetic diversity than Northeast Asians in comparison. And when it comes to the language families, there are some Austro-Asiatic, Thai, Kadani, and Austronesian language families, which also ties itself to Austronesia and that area. So now I'm going to get into the second group of East Eurasians, which are the indigenous East Eurasians, and these are very, very, very ancient lineages, as these groups split early from other East Eurasians and don't really exist in the modern form today, or even in more recent history. So these groups of people kind of don't really exist anymore, or they evolved into something that's just so unrecognizable. The first group are the Ainu and Ryukyuans from Japan, as the Ainu had Jomon ancestry predating modern East Asians, so these groups predated modern East Asians, hence them not really being a thing currently. And the Ryukyuans are intermediary between the Jomon and the Yayoi derived Japanese group. And then we also had the Siberian indigenous peoples, which is obviously in Siberia and North Eurasia, especially Northeast Eurasia, with peoples like the Yakuts, the Chukchis, the Koryaks, the Neviks, with deep East Eurasian roots, and some later gene flow with ancient North Eurasians. So the third group are Austronesians, which are maritime East Eurasians. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Their East Eurasians are existing where they live by the waters, hence maritime. So the regions go from Taiwan to the Philippines to Indonesia to the Pacific to Madagascar. And by to Pacific and Madagascar, they diverge their separate ways, going to the Pacific on the east and Madagascar to the west. And clearly, when it comes to the regions, the direction that I just read out, that's the order of how they became Austronesians, hence them originating in Taiwan. So the people included the Filipinos, the Polynesians, which includes the Samoans, Maoris, and Hawaiians, Micronesians, and the Malagasy, which are a mix of East Eurasian and African mix. So there's a major maritime expansion, and they're often mixed with Papuan or local populations as they expanded and evolved from there. So the fourth group of East Eurasians are Papuans and Melanesians, who are basal East Eurasians. And by basal, it's clear that they meant from the original group, but very distant and very deeply divergent. So that's what basal East Eurasians stand for. So the regions that are in this area are Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and parts of eastern Indonesia. So these are the furthest islands in the Pacific Ocean. They're further than Polynesians and they're further than Micronesians, and they're kind of just their own thing. So the key point is that they split from other East Eurasians very, very, very early on. They're essentially the oldest ones who did diverge from East Eurasians. There's high ancestry of the Denisovans, and they aren't closely related to East Asians despite the geographic proximity, because by the time they did diverge and then grow and evolve, they became kind of different and their own thing. Okay, and the final group that could be or are kind of considered East Eurasians are indigenous peoples of the Americas. And this is because of migration, as East Eurasian ancestry appeared there, and there are some of the earliest people who left East Eurasia. So they are descended primarily from East Eurasia via Beringia, which is the bridge from, or whatever, ice bridge from what's now known as Alaska and Russia. And with having that DNA and the ancestry from East Eurasia, that was a very, very, very long time ago, they also have additional ancient North Eurasian ancestry. Now that I got into the types of people who would fit under the East Eurasian group, now I want to talk about the difference between the genetic versus cultural meaning, and I'm going to get into that briefly. So, when it comes to the genetic meaning, East Eurasian is a population genetic macrocluster, not a race, though we're going to get more into that part a bit later. And what all this means essentially is that East Eurasians are populations that descended overwhelmingly from the Upper Paleolithic populations in East Asia, and they share ancestry that is distinct from West Eurasians, i.e., Europe and the Middle East, and ancient North Eurasians, so steppe adjacent. So they're different from the people who are a part of Eurasia. For that reason, you have this Upper Paleolithic origin. So when it comes to the important genetic realities, they aren't all homogeneous, or they aren't really homogeneous, as while Papuans, Han Chinese people, and Inuit people are all East Eurasian, they are distinct from one another. as their clinal variations, not hard borders, where admixture is the rule, not the exception. So now I want to talk about the cultural meaning of Eurasian, and there essentially is no meaning to it on a cultural point of view, as there's no shared culture, religion, or worldview across East Eurasians overall. What you can do is look at the differences, as if you look at conflict in East Asia, Islamic Southeast Asia, animist Poppins, Polynesian chiefdom societies, and Siberian reindeer pastoralists. It just lists those are just some of the major cultural differences. Obviously, there's more differences when you look into the pockets of each of these countries and nations, and even just communities and regions. So that's just a very simplistic way of looking at it. Culturally, they share no common religion, no common language family, no unified civilization, and no shared historical consciousness, where the term East Eurasian only survives culturally in the context of Europeans needing a binary of the West, or in contrast of the West, hence East Eurasia being called East. And it's kind of part of the Orientalization element to it. And here is where I'm going to somewhat tie this to a race, where in the 19th century, there's racial signs that lump East Eurasians with Mongoloid. So that's somewhat the tie when it comes to the racial lens. But overall, East Eurasian is an external classification, not an internal identity. Now I want to get into how East Eurasians is somewhat seen as Asian regarding a racial category, as the two things are often treated as interchangeable, but they aren't the same kind of category, and it's very just confusing overall. So, like I mentioned earlier, East Asians are people who shared a deep ancestry from East Asia centered Upper Paleolithic populations, which is identified through genetic clustering, not appearance or culture. Now I want to break down what quote unquote Asian is as a racial category, and this is based by the social, political, legal elements that cause it to be created as a racial construct. So the basis of this is that it was based on colonial era European racial science, where they are grouping people together on race based on their visual phenotype, so their facial shape, skin color, hair, etc. There's also the immigration policy and labor history that came into play with this, and how some people would identify as Asian or not, or could identify it or not, so they could get into certain countries. And the basis is also done through state classifications like the census, the law, and the civil rights. So in the United States and Canada, Asians, or as racial terminology, is referred to East Asians, Southeast Asians, and South Asians, which includes people from India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Though it excludes West Asians slash Middle Easterners, Central Asians who are often erased or misclassified in general, and Pacific Islanders, which are seen as separate administratively when it comes to race. In the UK, it's generally referred to as South Asians, or when over there, when Asians are referenced, it's usually in reference to South Asians, where East Asians are treated as a separate minority group. In Latin America, Asian is based on phenotype, nothing regarding ancestry, and it's mainly the Chinese and Japanese descendants who are recognized as this, where Southeast Asians and South Asians are often very invisible. Now, I want to talk about the overlap between the two terms in execution and in reality, and where they don't overlap. So, most people that are racialized as Asian do have East Asian or East Eurasian ancestry, overwhelmingly such. So, that's the main cut between the two terms there, where Northeast and Southeast Asians fit both categories extremely well, and they're usually the basis for the racial term of Asian and the other term of East Eurasian. So, in general, when people think of these two categories, they think of East and Southeast Asians, but there are other Asians that either fit this or don't, and there are other East Eurasians that either fit this or don't. We're going to kind of break it down. So, South Asians are seen as racially Asian, but they are genetically West Eurasian leaning, so they break the ancestry equals race assumption with this. Philippines and Melanesians are genetically East Eurasian, but they are rarely considered Asian, as they are either considered as indigenous or in their own areas as black, or they have their own category like Pacific Islander. When it comes to the indigenous Siberians, they are genetically East Eurasian, but they are also politically erased, as they are either folded into Asian, indigenous, or Russian category, so that's an issue there. And then we have indigenous Americans who are derived East Eurasians, so very distantly related, but they are never racialized as Asian and they are overall reclassified as native to preserve colonial racial order, especially in the West. So, why does this confusion persist? It's mainly because racial systems prioritize one, visible legibility, two, colonial history, three, power hierarchies, and four, administrative convenience. Nothing relating to biological reality. So the societies collapse with diverse East Asian or Eurasian populations being seen as Asian, and then splitting them again when it's politically useful or convenient. It's essentially why Pacific Islanders were separated only in the late 20th century, so only like 20 to 30 years ago, really. South Asians get lumped into the Asian category racially despite having different ancestry. Central Asians disappearing in general from the racial discourse, where East Asians get framed as quote unquote model minorities. Since a lot of discussion about race and the racial clusters involve phenotype, let's talk about the phenotypical traits that are associated with East Eurasians and or Asian people. And I'm referencing the statistical tendencies, not absolutes. So the main thing that they have is the facial morphology. So pretty much these are the traits most often noticed because they cluster visually. One is the orbital slash eye region traits, as this group has a higher frequency of epicantic folds, straighter upper eyelid crease, and a narrower palpebral fissure relative to skull width. I also want to add this important note. It isn't universal as it's rare in Poppins, though the variability in Southeast Asians is interesting. And this trait also appears in some indigenous Americans and Central Asians, though it is absent in many East Eurasians too. So, another element when it comes to the facial morphology is the facial flatness generally in the mid face. So, on average, there is a reduced nasal bridge projection. There's flatter midface relative to Europeans or Africans, and there's a wider zygomatic at each cheekbone region. This creates the quote unquote flatter face stereotype, but one, the degree varies widely, and two, some Southeast Asians and Siberians show stronger projection than the quote unquote average. Another element when it comes to the facial phenotype is the nasal shape. So pretty much on average, it is smaller, less projecting noses on average. They are rounded or low nasal bridge. These are more common, and pretty much this is due to the cold adapted groups, i.e., Northeast Asians and Indian people often having narrower nasal apertures due to the climate. Again, this is an average, not the rule. Okay, so the second phenotypical trait generally involves the hair, so mainly hair traits, which is one of, if not the strongest shared signal between East Eurasians. So the first thing is the hair texture, where they have a higher frequency of straight hair, so like type 1 hair, thick hair shaft diameters, and a circular cross section. So they have straight, thick hair generally, and it's one of the most, if not the most consistent East Eurasian tendency or trait when it comes to phenotype, the hair. Okay, the second element of this are the EDAR variant effects. So a specific genetic variant, EDAR V3708 or V370A, which is very common in East Eurasians, influence things like thicker hair, increased sweat glands, certain dental traits, and subtle facial structure differences. So this variant is not present in all East Eurasians and appears in some indigenous Americans, but it's the average median. So there is a very high variance when it comes to the skin and pigmentation, as they can be generally light or range to medium brown skin tone. So that's the wide variation when it comes to skin tone. Southeast Asians and Papuans are often darker, while Northeast Asians are often lighter on average. And there's a wide overlap with other populations when it comes to the topic of skin color. So overall, there is no single Eastern Asian skin tone. There is an overlooked element when it comes to East Eurasians, and it's the dental traits, as they have a higher frequency of incisor shuffling, they have larger incisors, and they have more robust molars, with these traits appearing on average in East Asians, Indigenous Americans, and some Siberian groups, as they are population level tendencies, not individual identifiers. And the fifth and final potential phenotypical trait is the body proportions. And this is generally climate linked. So on average, they have generally shorter limbs relative to torso in colder regions. Their builds are stockier in the northern populations, though tropical Southeast Asians often have longer limbs. So these are eco-geographic adaptations, not racial markers. So the bottom line, East Eurasians phenotypically share a higher frequency of certain facial, hair, and dental traits, though they don't have a uniform appearance, and it's not a reliable way to classify individuals. Phenotypes describes patterns, not people overall, where phenotype not doesn't necessarily equal race because racial thinking assumes traits are fixed, traits define identity, and traits align neatly with culture or behavior, while in reality, traits are statistical, they overlap heavily across populations, and they change with environment and admixture. So obviously describing all of that and dealing with the reality, just interacting in real life, may not add up. But in general, I just wanted to make this brief video about East Eurasians and how they're tied to Asian. I'm going to do this with two other groups as well. And if you follow my last few videos, this really shouldn't be a surprise as to what those two groups will be. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll be back with more content soon. Bye.